our next storyteller tonight, again, another very familiar face here at the Cabin Fever Slam. We've got Mr. Jim Ross up next. Let's see, he won the Story Slams with the themes Firsts, Change, and Wild. And then, let's see, when asked, what is something you've discovered or rediscovered that you've been enjoying while sheltering in place, Jim answered, dance movies. And if you could meet and hang out with one person, dead or alive, who would it be and why? This is a really good answer. Jim said, myself at age 20, so I could give me a heads up about the road ahead. Well done. I think we could all learn from that. All right, everybody, welcome Jim Ross.
Jimmy, quit telling tall tales. Second only to pick up your room and don't think you're leaving home dressed like that. My mother's admonition not to tell tall tales was probably the most frequent scolding of my childhood. But to be fair, I think Mom was probably concerned that she was perhaps raising a future politician and not, as it turned out, a future writer. But, sadly, she had to wait a few decades for her fears to be put to rest. But the day came, finally, sitting around my kitchen table with my youngest son, who was helping me go through about 2 weeks worth of accumulated mail. Mom was sitting there with her knitting needles, constructing something or other. She had ultimately more grandchildren than I can count, and those knitting needles were busy doing something all the time. But one of her grandchildren, my son, was there helping me go through this mail. And I was traveling a lot in those days. Fortunately, I found this wonderful father-son bonding thing to do, which was when I'd come home from these long trips, my son would help me go through the mail. And, he got a real kick out of it. But it wasn't just any mail. What he really liked to do was open the rejection letters that I was getting from publishers to whom I was sending out, stories and manuscripts. And this was back in the day before electronic transfer of documents. So a wannabe writer would, put a story in an envelope, hard copy, send it off by what I guess is now called snail mail, together with a stamped self-addressed envelope, so the publisher didn't have to spend its own money on postage and stamps simply to stuff in a form rejection letter saying thanks but no thanks. And I was sending out a lot of stories and I was getting a lot of these rejection letters, and my son just got an enormous kick out of reading them out loud. And he was about 9 years old at the time, and the truth be told, he wasn't much of a reader. As a matter of fact, until the Harry Potter books came out a few years later, the only thing he would read was my rejection letters. But I was fine with that. It's not like they were in short supply. And, if that's what it took to get him to read, so be it. Although Grandma wasn't, as cool on my laissez-faire approach to parenting or much else, she didn't say anything, but those knitting needles would kind of clack a Morse code that was unmistakable in that it would, get louder as he read louder. It didn't stop him, though. He would, open these things up and read out loud. Dear Mr. Ross, unfortunately. Dear Mr. Ross, we regret. Dear Mr. Ross, sadly. And laugh his little ass off. But of course, one day there came a time where he opened one of these things up and started to read, Dear Mr. Ross, we are delighted. And of course, he didn't get any farther than that because I literally leapt across the kitchen table, snatched the precious document out of his peanut butter and jelly smeared fingers, and at the same time, out of the corner of my eye, caught the look on my mother's face, which proved to me in that instant that jaw-dropping is not just a figure of speech. Well, that was more than 20 years ago. And recently, I was visiting that self-same son, who now, because the gods are, have a sense of humor, is also a writer. And one of the wonderful things about having an adult child who shares your professional interests is that sooner or later, as they get better at it, you become peers, colleagues, and he's quite good at this point. He's edited a couple of my books, and we talk a couple of times a week about what we're working on and the challenges, and he helps me out, I help him out. And recently, I was telling him about the problem I was having with finding the proper framework for telling the story of his opening my first publisher's acceptance. It's a cute little vignette, but it's not really a story. There's not enough there. And he said, well, no, it is a story. It's just not the one you think it is. It's like, okay, what's it about? And he said, well, first of all, it's not about you. It's about Grandma. And, it's not about, you're finally breaking the code to, getting published after decades of trying. It's about what that meant to her. And, if you just, instead of running around the kitchen like, Mel Gibson with his face painted blue, you could have focused on her. You would have seen that what she really wanted to do was say, son, I'm proud of you. Come sit next to me and tell me one of your wonderful tall tales. But she couldn't do it. And that's the story. Do you know why she couldn't? And I had to confess that, no, I don't. And he said, well, Dad, you really need to figure that out. And not just to write it, 1,000-word creative nonfiction piece for an online magazine that won't even be around next year, but to finally understand the woman who raised you. And, what were her fears and desires, and how did that impact, her parenting of you and your parenting of me and my brother, which, by the way, you still have a lot to answer for. And, I looked at the smarmy little 9-year-old who's, now all grown and bearded, and I knew he was right. But the problem is, I don't know the answer, and I may never know it. But he's right, I need to figure it out. And if I do, maybe there's a story in there I can share. So stay tuned. Thank you.